Today's EUROCONTROL Stakeholder Forum asks, how can we ensure Europe's communication, navigation and surveillance infrastructure meets the needs of both civil and military operations? Our expert Stakeholder Forum panelists will talk about the challenges of CNS evolution, security, interoperability, automation, and the path towards a harmonised and shared CNS infrastructure.
Good afternoon. My name is Jorge Pereira. I am the head of the Civil Military CNS Coordination Unit within Eurocontrol. And I welcome you all to today's technical webinar on the dual use of CNS Communication, Navigation, Surveillance Infrastructure. We have registered with satisfaction the high level of participants that have registered and that are connected to this event today. All participants will be able to participate, to submit their questions using the chat function, and in case you face any technical problems, you can use also the chat box, the same chat function, let's say to submit your request for assistance. This session today will be recorded and live streamed on YouTube and LinkedIn. We have already received a number of questions from the participants, so at the end we will try to provide answers to those questions. And then we will also try to address the questions that we receive in the meantime through the chat box that I mentioned before. We have with us 4 distinguished panelists that will help to shed some light on the topic that we propose to discuss today. In fact, we will try to respond to the question, how can the CNS infrastructure be used to support both the civil and military operations? And to respond to those, or to help us to discuss this topic, we have with us Squadron Leader Al Lindsell from the UK Ministry of Defence. We have with us Mr. Stephen Hanson from the NATO headquarters. We have Mr. Vicente de Frutos Cristobal from the European Defence Agency, and my colleague Mr. Jackie Pouzet from the EUROCONTROL Directorate Network Manager. Welcome. I will pass the floor to the panelists in a few minutes, but before that I would like just to make a short introduction to set the scene for our discussion today. Here in Eurocontrol, we live now in a new normal, and this relates to the ongoing war in Ukraine. And this conflict highlighted how vital are national security and defense interests to preserve our society, in fact. And this shows that the military missions are important when it comes to be able to deploy assets throughout Europe and to maintain the readiness of forces. The military fleet in Europe is composed by around 10,000 aircraft of multiple types and variants, and very soon we will have flying in European airspace around 350 F-35 Joint Strike Fighters, which are the 5th generation fighter aircraft. And this will create a number of challenges, because those operations need to be conducted with unrestricted access to the airspace and aerodromes. And in many cases, such operations need to be supported by the civil communication, navigation, surveillance infrastructure. Many military aircraft are equipped in accordance with the civil requirements regarding, for example, air-ground VHF voice communications with 8.33 channel spacing, or regarding surveillance mode S capability. But for many other requirements, the level of compliance remains low. And in this case, I mentioned, for example, data link and performance-based navigation, or automatic dependent surveillance broadcasts. And in parallel with that, the digitalization of the civil European CNS infrastructure is ongoing. We are introducing new technologies, and we are increasing the level of automation and the level of connectivity. And in parallel with that, we need to meet concerns related with safety, security, and environmental. The future civil CNS infrastructure needs to be more spectrum efficient and more performance-based and more integrated. Now, as this infrastructure changes and evolves, we need to ensure that we can continue to facilitate military operations. This is the main challenge, and we would like for the future to have a dual-use infrastructure where military operations can be, let's say, accommodated in a seamless and interoperable way. But we know that because of the equipage mismatch, this is not always possible, and sometimes the military need to continue to fly on the basis of equipage exemptions and special handling. ICAO is progressing a number of concepts that are performance-based, that they are technology agnostic concepts that allowing everybody, all the users, to use different equipment. And we believe that this is will also facilitate the compliance of the military with the civil CNS requirements. On the side of research, CESAR is expected to deliver a number of solutions to support civil military CNS interoperability as well. And concerning deployment, we still identify certain harmonization shortcomings, in particular when it comes to cross-border operations, and we would like to improve the situation. And in parallel with that, we know that some new technologies are introduced. At the same time, we eliminate redundancies and aging technologies, introducing the so-called minimum operational networks, so that we have a legacy of legacy systems that supports the continuity of the operations. An important security challenges will be there as this infrastructure evolves, because as we increase the, let's say, the levels of automation and connectivity, robustness and resilience of the infrastructure becomes a problem, and it triggers challenges that need to be addressed. And finally, we have a new entrant, so unmanned aircraft and drones that need to be accommodated, and this requires specific technologies to be deployed as well. So this is more or less, let's say, the scenarios that we have in front of us, and I believe this sets the scene a bit for the challenge that is that we have when trying to facilitate military operations. And with this introduction, I would like then to invite our panelists to express their views on the challenges that we face with this, let's say, evolving infrastructure that needs in the future to be able to support the civil and military operations. So our first channel is Squadron Leader Al Linsel, and Al, I would invite you to share with us your views on all this. I know it's a complex situation. Please go ahead, Al. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, George, and hello to everybody. It's lovely to see so many people from a global context looking at the chat at the moment. It's really good to see. My role is I'm the Communications, Navigation and Surveillance Policy Specialist for the UK Ministry of Defence, and my department works very closely with our civilian colleagues in the Civil Aviation Authority. And as the policy specialist, my role is to monitor national and international regulations and advise our various airspace users and equipment owners on what they may or may not need to do in order to maximise the freedom of manoeuvre in UK airspace and, of course, globally. Sometimes, as I'm sure you're all well aware, that requires advising them to comply with predominantly civilian regulations, as George has just mentioned. And sometimes they have to equip with civilian equipment, and we have to advise them to do that to the greatest extent practicable, not possible, practicable. For example, that's ADS-B on transport type aircraft intended to fly GAT IFR. I say as practical as possible because it may be possible to fit certain equipment, but it may not be the most appropriate thing to do. Because the thing that we have to remember, and I think that something that is often forgotten in a lot of the conversations that we have in various meetings, is that we're talking about military systems that are designed to do very different things to commercial air traffic. And sometimes I get the impression that we tend to more towards fitting in with the civilians and not necessarily helping out our military or considering our military operations. So we just need to make sure that we get that balance right. So I've been looking at the policy from a UK perspective, and I was very fortunate to be selected a few years ago to be the chair of the NATO Aeronautical Systems and Technology Working Group. And whilst I don't wish to steal any of Stefan's sandwiches, I think it's quite important for this meeting that I just sort of try to inform you of some of the approach that we've taken in that working group in particular to reviewing certain position papers with some of the technologies in mind. I won't go into the detail of those position papers because clearly this is an open forum, and whilst those papers may be NATO unclassified, that doesn't mean we can talk about them in this forum. But what I can do is talk about the methodology we used to come up with those positions. And really that came from sort of three questions that we asked in each technology. And it's the first, of course, is what is the technology we're talking about? And we've looked at TACAN, we've looked at PBN, we've looked at various other elements as well. I think most of them George touched on earlier. So first of all, what is the technology? The second thing is, why is it important to NATO? What does NATO need to do about it or think about it? And then primarily, what is the direction we can give to nations as to what they may be able to do? To do that requires quite an in-depth review of all the regulations, not just the European Commission ones, but 10 of the nations in NATO aren't members of the European Union. So we have to consider the global regulations as well, including what's happening in North America, Canada, and elsewhere. So having identified what the regulation is, we then sort of have to look at what do we need to do about it? And really, we're looking at two sides of the same coin. So first and foremost is, where appropriate, should military aircraft equip to the greatest extent practicable, again, to comply with civilian regulations? And I touched on the ADS-B element, and there are clear situations that require that adherence to the regulations. The flip side of that, of course, is there are going to be military aircraft that will not or cannot comply with those regulations. I shan't go into aircraft types, but they've already been mentioned. But we may not necessarily wish to be telling everybody where we are all the time. It's just not what we should be doing. So we need to then have this second side of the coin, as I mentioned. So if we're not going to equip as per the civil regulations, what do civilian and navigation service providers and such like need to consider in order to accommodate those military platforms? And so hopefully what we've done is look at both sides of that, and I'm sure we'll be addressing some of that as we move forward in these discussions. So I look forward to your questions.
Thank you all. NATO, as you highlighted, NATO plays a fundamental role as well in all these challenges. We have Stefan Hansen with us from the NATO headquarters. Stefan, can you share with us how NATO sees all those challenges?
Bon dia, George. Thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate being invited to this webinar. And I think this kind of event highlights the fact that NATO and EUROCONTROL have a really excellent working relationship. And events like this highlight our collaborative relationship and spirits that we have. And a lot of the people online right now, and a lot of you actually speaking, I've had an opportunity to work with over the last 3 years. And I appreciate all the fact that we work as a community in the aviation world. So as you know, I work at the policy level of NATO, working with the 30 nations, and the nations drive policy. The nations agree together on policy. And something the nations have agreed on are the NATO's critical missions, which are collective defense, cooperative security, and crisis management. And everything NATO does is guided by allies' security and defense needs, and the allies agree to this. So it's not NATO making decisions, it's the alliance making decisions together. From an aviation perspective, for NATO to be successful in these missions, there needs to be a well-established and continually evolving CNS capability across the alliance. So that's the reality of the situation. So the alliance's security and defense needs are of primary importance to the alliance. And how that affects aviation is that commercial and private aviation require a safe and secure environment to operate. We can see that in the eastern part of Europe at this time. There is a lack of security and safety due to the operations of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and therefore, we're having the issues and the ability for commercial operators to operate. A second thing that's really important for NATO is that the military operability across the alliance is a critical requirement. And this includes CNS. Alliance aircraft need to operate across the alliance with each other and with military aerodromes and with those organizations providing operational OAT services to them. The civil military operability across alliance is also a really important enabler. And once again, this includes CNS, because alliance aircraft in peacetime and conflict rely on civil and state CNS infrastructure to operate. And numerous state aircraft, if you didn't know this, are actually civilian contractors. For example, most equipment shipped by military equipment shipped by aircraft are actually transported by civilian aircraft doing a state role. Resilience in our CNS across alliance is a necessity, and the ability to maintain the required functionalities and services is the essential quality and availability, despite adverse impacts or change in the operational environment due to conflict or national disasters is really important. So resilience may require CNS independence or interdependence with standalone systems and in case of network failures or things like that. So that's a reality too. As I've mentioned before, security is indispensable for military operations and the same for CNS. So all aspects of security, to include physical information, human factors, and cybersecurity concepts, we have to consider that when we talk about the civilian and military CNS systems we have in Europe. And CNS is, and I think in my view, is a critical infrastructure for both state and civil aerospace actors. A lot of people will say critical infrastructure will be the energy grid or the highways. Well, for me, CNS is just as important because most of the capability of the alliance is through air power. As a NATO, we have to respect the sovereign needs of our ally members, and therefore the national aeronautical CNS networks, they are important, and therefore the national requirements of those nations we have to respect. But also we try to work with them to support multinational and alliance operational needs, both at the state and civil function level. We believe that for CNS, there needs to be a drive for innovation based on a clear and measurable understanding of present capabilities, emerging disruptive technologies, and further requirements. But remember, innovation needs to go forward, but it needs to recognize and respect resiliency needs. So to innovate just to innovate and get rid of technology that we still need to do the missions of today may not be the solution we're looking for. Excuse me as I move forward my notes. And we also have to acknowledge the realities of climate change. Defense and security needs of the alliance need to be acknowledged. We need to consider climate change in what we do, but at the same time, climate change should not trump defense and security needs of a nation or the alliance. So the idea is to innovate and move forward, and when we can, where practicable, and where we consider climate change and the environment and things like that. So the title of the webinar is CNS Infrastructure, How Can CNS Infrastructure Be Used to Support Civil and Military Operations? And from a perspective, my perspective, CNS infrastructure already supports both civil and military operations. And CNS infrastructure is critical infrastructure for the security and defense needs of NATO and the NATO nations. The CNS infrastructure at a national, whether it be civilian or military, needs to be resilient. And not only does it support defense and security needs, but also supports other state functions such as policing, search and rescue, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief efforts, or other things, for example. With the need for security and defense of the alliance always present, as we're seeing now in the eastern part of Europe, and considering the necessity for resilience in present and future CNS infrastructure, innovation must continue to drive forward, but coming up with new ideas, technologies, and capabilities, but not at the expense to try and choose CNS capabilities that provide the alliance with the resilience required in case of conflict or national disaster. So in general points of view, back to the question, how can CNS infrastructure be used to support both civil and military operations? It already is. In the future, we need new innovation, but we need to have a resilient system that supports the technologies that military and state operators require. And additionally, in my personal humble opinion, CNS infrastructure, whether it be civil, state, private, is a critical infrastructure and is a national asset. I hope that is pretty clear for you, George.
Thank you, Stefan. I couldn't agree more. And you touched exactly the critical aspects. But this subject has a huge, significant European Union dimension as well, because the European Union institutions they work a lot on all the aspects related with this problem, and to explain to us what is the views from the European Union side, I would say. We have with us Vicente de Frutos. Vicente, from the European Union perspective, how do you see these challenges?
Thank you, Jorge, and thank you for to the previous colleagues, because they painted very well the picture. I will contribute a little bit on top of that. I will give also a perspective of what we do here in EDA in collaboration also with EUROCONTROL NATO. We are developing this CNS strategy, military CNS strategy, and we are identifying some of the points I will raise now. I'll try to be pedagogic as well. And the main thing to remember, and this is what Alan and Stephen also mentioned before, is that yes, civil and military, we share the same airspace, and therefore we have to cooperate, being interoperable, etc. But the sharing of the airspace is done with different purposes or objectives. These different objectives, they will define the operations. Because they will define the operations, they will define also the systems. The civil, they're flying A to B. The main enablers or main drivers are performance, safety, cost efficiency, environment. The military are flying from A to perform security and defense missions. So first thing, different objective. Therefore, this common system, common infrastructure, common standards for ground, but also for airborne and even to space is a very good ambition. It will have a lot of advantages and synergies, economies of scale, interoperability, etc. But again, we have to keep in mind military specificities, considering that some of these military specificities may never be enabled by civil systems. This is important to have in mind. To illustrate this current picture, and I will elaborate a bit more on what Jorge was saying in the beginning, there are like two extremes when we're talking about the CNS civil military infrastructure. In one extreme, we will have a completely common dual-use standards and systems with many advantages, as we were saying before, compliance with civil regulations, economies of scales, cost efficient, perfect interoperability, minimum impact of civil aviation. This is the idea of equipped as civil. Typically, VHF is one example that fits also military requirements, but we have other examples that do not fit military requirements. ADSB, Al was saying before, we don't want to release where we are all the time. Typically, this is easier to have this idea of common equipage, for instance, for transport aircraft. The other extreme is typically what happens for fighters. There are systems that fit perfectly military requirements, but which are not interoperable with the civil. We could think of link system, inertial systems, etc. So they don't have the advantages maybe of the full common sharing, what we said before, economies of scale, interoperability. However, they fit perfect the military requirements. Before we had full compliance with civil standards, here what we have is exemptions. So at the end, we have these two extremes. I will use my hands that can be seen in the camera. And the answer to the 1 million euros question would be the right balance, no, between both extremes. Some right balance that allows for enough interoperability, enough economies of scale, but of course respecting the military specificities. And I will quickly address some of these examples between these two extremes. One first idea to be somewhere in between of these two extremes is a common layer of infrastructure, but then supplemented with military requirements on the top. This is typically what happens with Galileo or GPS. We have a dual-use common infrastructure, satellite, ground systems, etc., even the receivers. But then on the top, we have the specific part of the military, I think it's PPS, RPS, encrypted, authenticated signals that can be used by the state. Something similar, SWIM, for instance. We have also common protocols, common ground of infrastructure, etc. But on the top, we have specific military profiles that allows for military requirements, confidentiality, etc. Some other alternatives, considering this performance-based, in which we are looking at performance, we are not mandating the equipage. We could think of an ADSB that instead of, an ADSB system that instead of releasing the information from the military to the civil side directly, is doing military on the air, military on the ground, and then it is the military on the ground sharing the information with the civil on the ground. This is the idea of performance-based. And some other examples, the inertial system being used for PBN, etc. These are promising ideas. These are things that are being already studied. CESAR, Eurocontrol, you are doing a lot of work on that. There is technology research ongoing. But one of the important things for this research is to complement it with what normally I call impact assessment, cost-benefit analysis. Something that which is done, which addresses the complete picture, we call it holistic systemic picture, etc., in which these decisions are based on studies or good impact assessment, where we have into the equation, we include the impact of this decision on military mission effectiveness, the impact on civil aviation performances at different levels, at the local, for instance, TMA, at network level, the impact of safety, and essentially the impact on the cost. And the cost for the military, we need to address the size, the type of fleets, when the fleets are going to be decommissioned. It is not the same to equip a fleet that will be decommissioned in 5 years, that something that we have just bought. I mean, all these things. And of course, this specifically for the case of each kind of type of aircraft, each kind of equipment. We were saying that transport typically is easier than fighters. Navigation, communication, they may present different alternatives. So all this is agreed and known. There is work ongoing, as we were saying before. The regulatory environment is ripe. I mean, the EASA basic regulations enables this performance-based approach, which would allow for all these ideas that I was presenting before. So yes, I mean, there is work ongoing. The regulatory regime is enabling it. So yes, let's aim to reap the benefits of this common and single dual-use system infrastructure, but keeping in mind that they have to incorporate the military specificities and needs from the outset. And to be done, for this to be done, again, the message is for all, for the military to be proactive and being involved from the outset in all the discussions, and of course from the civil side to be adequate, listening, to what the military are proposing. And I'll be happy to continue in the next Q&A session.
Thank you, Vicente. I couldn't agree more again that we need some trade-offs, and we need to be realistic, at least for the short term, while addressing maybe the longer term challenges in a different way. We have also the network manager performing important functions regarding the CNS infrastructure, for example, the monitoring the levels of performance of the CNS infrastructure. And from the Directorate Network Manager of the Eurocontrol, here in Eurocontrol, we have Jackie Pouzet, who was working on this for a long time now. So Jackie, can you please share with us how do you see all those problems?
Thank you very much, George. Good afternoon, everyone. And yes, you have said already a lot, and mainly for our military colleague. I'm more working on the civil side. So, but we agree all on the fact that military or civil are doing complementary mission, but in the same airspace. So consequently, they must cooperate, otherwise it doesn't work. I recall that the purpose of the civil ATC is to ensure the safety, so mainly the separation, while providing the appropriate capacity in the airspace. And you may have seen that after the crisis, the traffic went down, but traffic is back now. Today, we were at 85% of the 2019 traffic, and we are expecting a growth in the next coming months. So military, as you said, is one of the biggest airlines in the world with around 10,000 aircraft. So consequently, they have to be, and with some special missions, so we have to be sure that we are cooperating well for the military missions. Regarding the general air traffic, the military are treated with like standard aircraft, and it's important that they are compliant with the civil system and they are following the civil regulation. But we should not forget as well, as mentioned by Vicente, that the cooperation and the exchange of data to support both missions, civil and military, is vital. And mainly to support the military operation, military have to get access to the flight plan, to the aircraft identifications, to the airspace structure and so on, to close the airspace when it's necessary. And that's the role of the network manager and the different air navigation service provider to cooperate closely for military, for being sure that both operations can be done smoothly in a safety airspace. Another common denominator that we have is the spectrum. And the spectrum is one of the key elements for CNS, because without spectrum, we don't have any CNS services. Consequently, we have to avoid the saturation of the spectrum. We have to avoid the interferences between civil and military, but we have also to avoid any jamming, spoofing, or all the things that can happen on the spectrum. That's why it's important to cooperate. Regarding the research, we have to ensure the compatibility and the common usage of the different technologies. One of the next challenging steps for the civil ATC is to have a secure data link. So military can provide a lot in terms of security because they used to do that, but we have to be sure as well that military aircraft can be incorporated securely in the data link system using potentially their own system, and here opening the door for the performance-based communications as mentioned as well before. Another area of cooperation is the common technology, mainly the software-defined radio, where military have a lot of experience. The spectrum efficiency for being sure that we are operating efficiency with the spectrum that is allocated to aviation. And at last but not least, we should not forget the disruptive technology that is coming with the UAS or the drones, because they are operating differently with different technology, and integrating them in the airspace and in the CNS is a real challenge. So the next step in this area are currently being discussed at European Commission, who hold a workshop recently on CNS that will have a new deployment manager for the new technology that will require a closer cooperation, mainly to maintain the airspace flexibility, the cooperation on spectrum, but also for the technology and the link with the drone and the airspace operator. So that's one of the key challenges for CNS in the next coming years. And of course, to coordinate on interferences and jamming. Regarding more in details on the communication, I think the previous speaker mentioned the need to communicate with military aircraft. So they are operating with different systems. Military are using UHF, while let's say civil are using VHF. But on the VHF, all the civil aircraft are now migrated to 833, which is not the case for all the military aircraft. And the states have granted some exemption that will go up 2028. But one of the key messages for military colleagues is being sure that you are equipped with 833, otherwise it will be extremely difficult to maintain the communication. And it's very expensive as well to maintain a double coverage. So it's important to have the same level of equipment. Data link is the same. I mean, all aircraft have to have the same equipment, and the military aircraft will have to be equipped with the data link and coming soon, the 4D trajectory management. I think Vincenzo mentioned previously the ground cooperation and exchange on the ground. It's also a very important domain to maintain the close cooperation between air traffic control and air defense. A typical example are the standards. For instance, for the voice communication, the ground infrastructure is moving to voice over IP with the new EUROCONTROL standard. It's important to have the same interface in the military system. It's the same for the ATS messaging that is operating over the AMHS network that will have to migrate soon to the SWIM environment. So it's important to do that together for being sure that systems are maintaining the interoperability. For the voice and data, Civil have developed now a pan-European network service, which is a sort of pan-European IP backbone that is interconnected a large number of stakeholders and NSP on the ground. And it's important the military are part of this exercise as well. Satellite is a key element for communication, navigation, and surveillance. And again, aircraft have to be equipped to operate with both systems, but also the ground infrastructure. Regarding the management of common resources and parameters such as the radio frequency function, we have to be sure that we continue to share the frequencies as we are doing it today with the NM function, that is the radio frequency functions. I will go relatively quickly on navigation because my colleagues have already spoken. I would like to insist on the last point on the surveillance, which is important to maintain a primary radar coverage for the military and in close cooperation with the civil for being sure that we can share the tracks, the same track for the air defense and for ATC. IFF4 should not be used anymore. We recall that IFF5 is the way to provide identification. And I remember, don't forget that in that area, we are sharing the same 1090 frequency that we have to be sure that we are not saturating it. And last but not least, we have to coordinate the aircraft identification for being sure that in case of air defense, we have the appropriate cooperation. So in few words, and to conclude, George, yes, cooperation has to continue in the operational domain, in the CNS day-to-day maintenance of the infrastructure and spectrum. And it's very important to cooperate for the future systems that are coming, for being sure that we can continue to maintain the appropriate capacity in the airspace while having the military operation perform smoothly in the same environment. And that is basically the conclusion of my introduction. I would be pleased to answer to the question you may have.
Thank you, Jackie. I think you touch a number of points that are really, really important. So if I could summarize where we are so far with the discussion, I think I understood that we need to be realistic and we need some quick wins because we have only one airspace. It's hard to use multiple systems at the same time. And it is not only when the military operations are conducted as general air traffic. In some countries, we have even some operational air traffic services that are delivered by the civil air navigation service providers. And then the civil infrastructure is used. So, this is an important challenge. But I would like to highlight at this point that any decisions on what has to be done in the future are normally on the national side. So the national authorities are those that will take decisions to implement whatever solutions. And we still see in Europe a certain level of fragmentation. So when it comes to cross-border operations, the level of harmonization is not ideal, and the different states have different situations. So we need to deal with this problem because one size does not fit all in all cases. And as Stephen highlighted, at the end of the day, our target should be to have one single infrastructure that can support all the operations, and we have then to address the security challenges, because as we increase automation and connectivity, we need to ensure that the system remains robust and resilient. As Vicente mentioned, there are some trade-offs that need to be conducted, addressing the costs and to balance cost against decisions for implementation. I highlighted what Jackie said, the importance of spectrum. It is, some people say the spectrum is the most one of the most important resources of aviation, and we see more and more competition for spectrum. So this is an area where we need civil-military coordination to take place, because the military are the biggest user of spectrum around the world. We need to ensure that satellite technologies can be used, but there is a vulnerability, because we are never sure that the satellite signals remain always available. And then in certain cases we need terrestrial gap fillers or backup for that. These are some of the points that have been discussed. We are receiving at the moment questions in our chat box. It's a bit difficult to read. I would invite my colleagues to increase the font size. But we may start with the questions that participants already submitted. And the first question I would like to address was submitted by IFATSEA, and it invited us to explain what is the minimum operation network concept, and to explain what this concept is about and how you see that. I will invite first Stefan and then Vicente. So Stefan, what do you think about minimum operation networks?
Thanks a lot, George. What do I think about minimum operating networks? I am not a fan of the term. Some of the staff at EUROCONTROL provided us some definitions of AMON, which included concepts of resilience in the definition, but it's not an accepted definition. And most people, when they hear the term minimum operating network, they think minimum. So, the least capability necessary to achieve what they want to achieve. In some cases, that could be one capability. And speaking about radios, we will all have VHF 8.33 channel spacing radios. That's it. That's all. But there's a difference between civilian and military requirements in CNS, but there's also differences in civilian requirements in CNS. An air transport company versus a company that's doing firefighting a forest. So not everyone has the same requirements of what a minimum is. I've really preferred the term a minimum resilient operating network, but I don't get to decide on definitions. I just make suggestions. And I think the minimum resilient operating network needs to consider or be composed of the minimum CNS requirements of all the stakeholders, as well as a minimum secondary requirement for all the stakeholders. So there's more than one of everything to do, and it meets all the stakeholders' needs. And that could mean that there are 3 or 4 different types of communication systems, and 3 or 4 different types of navigation, and 3 or 4 different types of surveillance. But in the end, it meets all the users' requirements. And I think that's a critical concept we need to have. The reality is every airspace, every aviation operator, whether they wear a uniform, military, civilian, state, or even a private operator, has a different reason to use the airspace. And because of that, the technology they need to do CNS is going to be different. And so therefore, we need to come up with a minimum operating network that is both meets everyone's needs and has resiliency built into it. So that's my opinion. I hope I explained a bit of what MON is and why I would like to expand the view.
Vicente, what can you say about this?
My opinion, it fits to what Stephen said. I will say from the point of view of the work we've been doing into the CNS advisory group work. First, there are several definitions for MON. It's true. ICAO, Eurocontrol for nav. In the ATM master plan, you have another one. But at the end, most of them, it's a layer of existing technologies that should complement these new technologies that are coming. These new technologies, as you were saying before, they may have some weaknesses: automation, digitalization, SATCOM, etc., etc. So you need to make sure that these new technologies that are very good, if they fail, you still have something that can support a minimum level of business continuity for the civil operations, and a minimum or a maximum, and this is something to be decided, of military mission effectiveness. Then this is from the conceptual point of view. From the regulatory point of view, there is a national minimum operational network. Air navigation services and CNS is a national responsibility. So the minimum operational network should be decided by the states. This is why in the CNS advisory group work, we've been defining these specific actions for the state. And this is, again, as I was saying before, it will be the state doing this arbitrage, this trade-off, this right balance between, again, two extremes. In one extreme, you will have a very efficient, cost-effective minimum operating network, but with low resilience. For instance, you can share a lot of infrastructure with your neighbor. And the other extreme, no, you don't want to share anything. It will be very, very expensive. It will be very resilient. Always, let's find a trade-off. Then we have this dimension of, yes, but we have to ensure a certain level of interoperability, harmonization, for harmonization at European level, at the global level, etc., etc. So again, I mean, let's find this right balance, and again, this right balance should be decided by the states, but of course, keeping in mind all this work of harmonization that we are doing in the CNS advisory group, ICAO, ATM master plan, etc., etc. This is all.
Thank you, Vicente. Okay. I read somewhere a definition of MON, but only for navigation, saying that it is about the retention of a layer of nav aids that can support nominal and contingency operations. Maybe this one would, let's say, cover what you are saying together with the robustness aspect that Stephen highlighted. The next question we have relates to the new entrants, and it was submitted by the NATO international staff, and it reads: will the new entrants, given their specific communication requirements, pose a risk to normal CNS structure? I would invite Jackie to try to respond to this one. Jackie.
Thank you, George. I think it's a very good question, and obviously, yes, we can see that we have new entrants in the airspace, typically the drones, for instance, for which we have to change the way we are operating, because most of the time the pilot is not on board the aircraft but is on the ground. So it means that the voice communication should be done between two ground interfaces, and sometimes the pilot is on the other side of the air. So it's a new requirement. So definitively, it's a disruptive technology for the operation, for the type of aircraft, but also for the CNS infrastructure, because when we are talking about very light drones, they may sometimes don't have the appropriate power to ensure and to be equipped with the standard equipment. So there are a lot of discussions that are going on in the research environment, and there is even a research project called FACT at European Commission that is trying to accommodate all the drones in the airspace in an airport environment, and that's a project that is going on. The first trial will take place during the summer, but it's a typical, let's say, a new coming. The second part is the high altitude platform, because for high altitude platform, sometimes we may not have the appropriate CNS coverage to ensure the nominal, let's say, function that we used to have so far. So for sure, yes, there are new entrants that will giving some very specific requirements that are requiring research and development and also cooperation, because we should not forget that, like for aviation, one of the main operators of the drones are the military for both, let's say, GAT or OAT. So consequently, we have to cooperate in this area.
Thank you, Jackie. So the next question, again for this time for Stephen and for Al, was submitted by the European Space Agency, and they asking what is the biggest challenge for civil-military CNS harmonization? Stephen, we can start with you maybe.
Thanks, George. So this answer is my opinion. I'm just from background, I'm a dual qualified air traffic controller and air defense controller who worked in North America and Canada, where I actually controlled more civilian aircraft than I controlled military aircraft in airspace that was receiving an airport that was receiving both types of aircraft. So my perspective is a bit different than I think from a OAT, GAT approach to life. So in my opinion, the issue seems to be a question of perspective of the civil versus state concepts and a history of development of GAT and OAT perspectives of air traffic control and CNS in Europe. Civil aviation stakeholders have to fulfill state functions. State aviation stakeholders have state functions they have to do, and they have to do it effectively and efficiently, but effectiveness is more important, because when you're trying to save lives or provide security and defense, if you're ineffective, unfortunately, you don't have an airspace to be operating in the future. Civil aviation stakeholders have very other functions to fill, and many of them are profit-based, but not all of them. Some of them have an effective goal also, specifically if you're talking about air ambulances and things like that. So I think the biggest challenge is having all the sides of the discussion understand the requirements and driving factors of the other stakeholders. And the CNS needs all this. And I saw the chat, the people saying, once again, we're asking for all to understand all the stakeholders, but the CNS infrastructure needs to understand what the stakeholders need to be effective and efficient. And but there needs to be priorities, and the highest priorities should be those critical to the safety and well-being of the nation and its population. In my previous life, we had actually a priority list of operators in airspace and who gave way to who. And sometimes the military was lower down the list depending on what they were doing. It was about what they were doing and what they brought to the nation and state. And that's going to be a state decision in Europe. But it's important to understand what are their priorities. In the alliance and NATO, we try to align all 30 nations together so that our priorities and what we do and how we provide security and defense all match each other. But, and this is personal opinion one, again, one fact is clear, that without security and defense, airspace will not be open for business, whether it be state functions or civil functions. So, and just a push, I just wrote this down, maybe some of the nations out there who are looking to provide, their 2% to help support security and defense in Europe, maybe that could be by working on CNS solutions that support a unified structure in their nation. That could be a possibility. But in the end, it's security and defense are important for the alliance.
Thank you, Stephen. Al, can you complement this, please?
Yeah, I think I've approached this from a slightly different perspective. I say slightly different, a very different perspective. But I include the same caveat that this is Al's opinion. And certainly not a state position in any way, shape, or form. But I think it's a great question, and of the many challenges that face civil-mil harmonisation, I think for me, the biggest one.
Well, I think we lost Al for some moments. Yeah. So Al, we are not able to listen you. Some network connectivity problems, most likely. So I propose that we progress with another question while Al is not able to reconnect. We have one question originated from some EUROCONTROL, from inside the EUROCONTROL, in fact, and it is about how can the military take advantage of their own military CNS capabilities and the performance-based approach to seek compliance. And I would invite Jackie to address this question. Jackie, what can you say about this?
Yes, George. First, I mean, you can see the importance of communication. We just lost Alan. So you see when you have a problem in communication, sometimes it's difficult. So coming back to your questions, yes, military can take advantage of their own CNS capabilities and performance-based approach, because most probably the civil world will move to a performance-based approach as well. We are seeing that already in the domain of the navigation. We have the performance-based communication and surveillance in the oceanic airspace using satellite communication and also satellite surveillance. So for sure, it's an area on which we are going to move. I mean, we will be successful in moving on this path and hence beneficial if we are able to operate with the technology that are already available. One of the clear signals we've got from the different airlines is to avoid having equipment on board the aircraft or new technology on board the aircraft for the same purposes. So if we can reuse what is available, and I'm sure it's the same for the military environment, then we will take benefit. To achieve that, we have to ensure that we have the appropriate gateways and exchange of data on the ground that can perform these functions. That will be one of the main challenges for the new SWIM environment, to ensure that we have a smooth integration of the different systems, but at the end, being sure that we are meeting the appropriate requirement. So for sure, I mean, military can take advantage of their own CNS capabilities if they are able to share on the ground with ATC all the data that they need to have. It doesn't prevent to continue the cooperation on CNS, mainly for the exchange of primary data information, for instance, to ensure the appropriate cooperation.
Thank you, Jackie. So I propose that we move to the next question, also submitted by EUROCONTROL, internal EUROCONTROL colleagues. And the question is, what legacy CNS infrastructure segments need to be retained to sustain military operations? Jackie, can you please try to cover this one as well?
Yes, I mean, we were talking previously about the current VHF and UHF coverage. So it's important for the time being to maintain this legacy infrastructure, because we know we have a large number of aircraft that are flying with this technology. They will continue to fly, and we know that like all the aircraft, it's very difficult to retrofit aircraft. Retrofitting a fighter is something that is extremely expensive for the military, and if we can avoid that, we will try to avoid that. So that's why it's important. This legacy system has to be maintained, but the military have to understand that they cannot be maintained for long, because it has a price for the ANSPs. When they have to maintain a UHF coverage, for instance, or a 25 kHz coverage just for military purposes, it's not something that is free of charge. And we are starting seeing some ANSP that are saying we can maintain the service, but then the military will have to pay. So it's more a discussion between civil and military, but it's just showing the importance of maintaining, let's say, this legacy infrastructure. It's also valid for the communication and navigations, because again, for the retrofit of aircraft. I mean, the conclusion of that is very important to have a common roadmap for the next step evolution and technologies. We are, for the time being, as one of the options, the LDAX technology. It will be used to have the military showing an interest on this technology to see if it cannot be used for other purposes, because it's something that is secure, that has been designed to operate for civil environment, but is coming from the military environment, because the requirements in terms of security in the civil airspace are increasing a lot. They are not yet at the level of the military, but that's an area on which we can have a common understanding and common evolution. But there are a number of legacy CNS infrastructure that will have to be maintained for long. And it's important that before decommissioning, there is a strong cooperation in order to avoid to maintain an infrastructure for just 3 or 4 aircraft that are flying once a year.
Thank you, Jackie. If I may, I would like to highlight in this respect that there is a notion that we sometimes speak about the technology convergence between the civil and the military. But these are things that can only be done normally for the medium long term. And in that respect, what we need the military to be involved since the outset in all the developments. I mean, research, even some industrialization, standardization developments. It is important to have the military involved since the outset so that the military needs can be reflected at this level, and then at the end we can have a solution that is common for the civil and for the military. We have some solutions in some domains. We have, for example, in the surveillance, the military transponders. The same equipment can support civil and military requirements at the same time. So we could have more of this in other domains, but it's something that requires research and needs only to be done for the longer term, for sure. So we have covered this particular question as well. The next one is a question related also from the Eurocontrol, related on it's at the end of the day, the handling of civil and military flights with one single infrastructure. Is that to foster harmonization interoperability? Is that a viable goal? Or at the end of the day, we will always have separated infrastructures to support the local requirements and the civil and military requirements. I would invite Stephen to cover this one. Stephen, what do you think about this?
Well, I'm kind of spoiled because I came from an organized country where we had air traffic controllers from both the military and civilian side taking care of both civilian and military aircraft. And we actually had really good programs in the past where we would coordinate and discuss CNS requirements. And at sometimes the military had specific CNS to support what we needed, and other times the civilians had it also. But where we could, we would share program management. We would share parts. We actually had agreements where the civilian side would repair military and vice versa. And there's continual discussion of all the stakeholders. Much smaller population, much larger airspace, but stakeholders continually discussed what was required. And at the air traffic management side also, I mean, the rules and regulations and the policies and procedures were discussed together. So it can be done. But, you know, the issue is it's a national, it's a state decision. And we live in a region of the world right now where there is a lot of states and they all have their own individual structures. And as I saw in the chat, you know, the Swiss have a different model than the Austrians and the Germans and the French, et cetera, et cetera. And so, is it a viable goal? Yes, I think it should be our goal that, you know, at a national level, the more efficiency and effectiveness we can have, and who pays for it, whether it comes from a civilian or from a state organization, from a military organization, has to be decided internally. And while nations will always decide what they want, obviously, if there's a harmonization across the states on how they're doing business, and as we've seen some of that harmonization in NUAC with the Germans and the Dutch working from there, these are all possible. But it takes a lot of discussion, a lot of politics, and a lot of each nation to decide what they want. And hopefully, we'll continue to go in that direction.
Thank you, Stephen. We have received a question regarding EUSpace submitted by HHLA Germany GmbH. How might this topic be affecting, or this topic meaning the CNS infrastructure revolution, be affecting the creation of a EUSpace environment when operating automated drones? There is a great need to have a full aerial picture of all traffic. As Al is not there, I try to say something about this respect. In fact, when we try to accommodate or to define solutions to accommodate or integrate drones or unmanned aircraft, let's say we need to define specific technical solutions But I believe this represents also an opportunity for the manned aviation, because you know, the drone and unmanned aircraft requirements, they serve as a catalyst for the manned aviation, and then the solutions that are identified on one side in terms of air-ground data link and detect and avoid and all that, they can also be used, let's say, to promote better solutions that are defined and validated for manned aviation as well. And another aspect that this question mentions is the need to ensure that appropriate data is available where needed to compile the air picture. And this is a fundamental aspect in general, because the military functions require the appropriate identification of all the flights, and in some cases the military can only do that by receiving information from the civil side. And this, let's say, connectivity and ability to exchange data between the civil and the military side triggers some security-related concerns. And I think Jackie mentioned already, then we need appropriate interfaces, we need IP connectivity to be implemented in a way that the level of security are appropriate, and basically to respond in accordance with the sensitivity of data that is flowing in both directions. So yes, it is. These are important challenges, and a significant level of work is ongoing in this respect. I was trying to see if we already have Al connected. It's not yet there. So he's having some network problems. So I propose to progress to the next question. This one originated from the EUROCONTROL as well. How could the ground and space-based military infrastructure, primary radar, GPS, etc., contribute to a common dual-use ATM CNS infrastructure usable by all categories of airspace users? And I would invite Vicente to address this particular question. Vicente, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm here again. I will pick up these questions from the minimum operational network perspective, because there were some activity in the chat. There was a colleague complaining that I had changed the definition. I was paraphrasing. It's true. The definition to which I, of course, agree. For me, the one that fits better my interpretation is the one in the CNS advisory group. I copied it, pasted, and again, paraphrasing it. This minimum operational network shall guarantee safety and security are not compromised in the case of an outage of the backbone infrastructure. If you go to the ATM master plan in the CNS roadmap, you will see what is the backbone infrastructure. In the backbone infrastructure, among other things, it relies a lot on space assets. Why do we need them on? Because space assets, as you were saying before, Jorge, and I quote, we are never sure. You said, and I like this because there are many inherent risks to satellite services. I mean, there are many advantages, but there are several risks. First, the signals are weak, they are omnidirectional, they are easy to jam and spoof. We are seeing it now, unfortunately, in current crisis. But then the space is becoming every time more and more congested. This implies a lot of satellites in the same orbit. This implies a lot of risk of collisions. Typically, in the low Earth orbit, geostationary orbit, there are a multitude of satellites. There is a need to control them to ensure there are no collisions. EU is working a lot on that. Space traffic management, actually, it's a new initiative that will try to do with space something similar to what we are doing for air traffic management, especially collision avoidance. I mean, these kind of things for satellite. But not only that, I mean, furthermore, solar activity has also an impact on satellites. So considering that the backbone based on space has some weaknesses, we need to have a good minimum operational network. And this minimum operational network has to fulfill both civil and military. So at the end, the way to define it is by, as I was explaining in the beginning, doing studies, impact assessment, cost-benefit analysis, etc., etc., to see how we could respect most of the airspace user requirements, etc., and to put everything into the perspective, considering at the end that, of course, it will be for the state to have the last say into the definition of the local and national minimum operational network.
Thank you, Vicente. In this respect, I would like to highlight that GNSS monitoring is one of the most important tasks that we have here related with the network manager or network functions that monitor the level of performance of the CNS infrastructure. And we are dealing on a daily basis with a huge number of GNSS outages that are caused by natural events or by jamming, and we have produced even some guidance on that, and we are trying to maintain close cooperation with NATO on that and with other with some national colleagues. So this shows that I'm convinced that in the future we will use more and more satellite technologies to support aviation requirements, both in the navigation domain, position determination, timing, and to synchronize the clocks of networks, and also for communication purposes. We have Aerion, satellite-based ADS-B that supports global tracking. We have all that, but the problem is that it cannot be the sole means in many cases, and we need a terrestrial backup or minimum operational networks or whatever, because it's really an infrastructure that presents a significant number of vulnerabilities. So I couldn't agree more with you on that. We have one question, and this was a question for Al, as Al is not able to reconnect. We cannot, I think something we need to cover is the environmental dimension. There is a significant level of discussions ongoing on sustainability, on how to address environmental challenges and the need to reduce CO2 emissions. And there was a question related to that submitted by Comesa, and they asking us how is the military playing their role on flexible use of airspace and reduction of CO2 emissions. So the CO2 emission part of this question, I don't know if any of you wants to elaborate on that. I may say something in this respect. It's something very important. How can the military contribute to CO2 reduction? Gentlemen, any views on that? Stefan, please go ahead.
So I know from an alliance perspective that a lot of the individual nations from a military perspective and state aircraft perspective are looking at means to reduce emissions such as SAF and things like that. And the United Kingdom is a perfect example also. I believe, if I'm correct, they're attempting to get to environment impact zero air bases and things like that with offsets and things like that. So I do know that from an environmental point of view, quite a few members of the alliance are looking towards a way to make their activities and operations more environmentally safe, with not losing efficiency for the operations that we have to do. But additionally, I think such concepts such as the flexible use of airspace and trajectory and stuff like that, that is important because it actually will provide a better use of the airspace we have, since it is a national resource. And so one of the effects of that is also going to be hopefully better for the environment, because more direct flights, airspace used when it's needed, and by the appropriate operator, less traveling around airspaces to get to that as we do so. So in the end, I do know from a personal perspective that there are numerous air forces and militaries across the alliance trying to be better citizens in questions of environment.
Thank you, Stefan. I believe at the end of the day, the military are doing a lot about sustainability, simply maybe not communicated in all occasions. Okay, with that, I apologize for the questions that were submitted that we could not address. We will try to address them offline after the event. but time is running, and I really apologize that our colleague Al Linsel had a power cut and could not really reconnect. But I believe we could cover most of the questions anyway. And so if I may summarize a little bit, so we have some challenges in front of us. So we want to believe that the future infrastructure can be used by the civil and the military, but of course there are some trade-offs to respect, and military requirements must have priority. And we will try to improve the situation in the context of research, in the context with some quick wins related with deployment, to address the challenges from introduction of air-ground data links, the introduction of performance-based navigation, the optimal mix that we will have to support surveillance separation functions, ADS-B, and take advantage of performance-based concepts to be more spectrum efficient and to address the particular needs of the new entrants, and not to forget security, robustness, and resilience of the future CNS infrastructure. So with that, I would just pass the floor back to the panelists for a final word. Stefan, something additional to say?
No, just to reinforce that, I think the CNS infrastructure already does support both civil and military operations, activities, and training. Additionally, it's a critical infrastructure, CNS, for security and defense. Without it, it'd be very difficult to provide security defense for NATO nations. I completely agree it needs to be resilient, and it's not a resilient to the level of just basically getting people home, but resilient to continue operations and doing what we do. And I really think innovation is really important, but innovation, we need to push the envelope. We need to find new ways to communicate, navigate, and do surveillance. But additionally, we also need to realize that some of those older technologies are necessary for not just the military, but for other functions that the nations have. And in the end, the nations are going to decide what their priorities are.
Thank you, Stefan. Vicente, something to add?
Yeah, I mean, both of you were already perfectly summing up everything. Just to say that this common infrastructure for both is a good level of ambition. I would say in mathematical terms, it's like an asymptote. We have to aim to this. We may never reach it completely, but the closer we get, the better for all of us. And I think the way to get close to it is all the ways you were mentioning before. I mean, innovation, performance-based regulation, etc., etc. So this is all.
Thank you, Vicente. So with that, I think we don't have Jackie with us at the moment. We have Jackie. Jackie, any final remarks?
Yes, a very quick final remark. So just to recall that civil-military cooperation is essential. You mentioned for the day-to-day operation, you mentioned the flexible use of airspace, but also it's essential in increasing mode. We are, for the time being, living a very strong crisis event, and it's important to have strong cooperation for being sure that we are, let's say, managing the event properly. We can have other events like solar event or whatever. CNS efficiency is essential for the safety and the capacity of the system. So we shall continue and reinforce the cooperation for the research, for continue to exchange data with the current, but also with the coming new standard. Continue the research and development of software-defined radio, for example, but also continue the research for the use space compatibility between civil and military, 4D trajectory management, performance communication, and so on. And my last message for the military: continue the aircraft identification. It's key for ATC. Equip your aircraft with 833 radio, because we would like to have all the radio equipped by 2028, and data link. And don't forget to follow the ground system evolution and mainly the migration towards winds. And that's basically my conclusion, Joe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jackie. So we will see one slide in a minute showing let's say, who is available to support you within the Eurocontrol. So we have a small team within the agency, the Civil Military Coordination CNS unit. with some people that are there to support you. So in case you have any questions or you need technical support on civil military CNS matters, I am there to provide you this support. We have Bart van der Heijden, a colleague dealing with communications and spectrum, Ricardo Oliveira dealing with navigation and innovation, and Sven Rensmeyer covering surveillance. And you have a collective address there that you can use to send us some requests as you feel needed. And with that, I would like to say a word and to invite you for the next events in this EUROCONTROL Stakeholder Forums series. And the next webinar will be a strategic webinar which will take place on the 18th of May. And it will address the question, how do we prepare for the busiest summer season since 2019 and work to minimize the operational impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the European aviation network. So this will be the next webinar, and I would invite you all to connect. And with that, we reach the end of the event for today. I would like just to express my appreciation for your interest, and I hope that we have contributed a little bit to discuss this complex topic. And please be in touch with us in case you need any additional support on civil military CNS matters, or in case you have additional questions that require an appropriate response. With that, I would like to really thank also for the panelists for helping us to conduct this discussion. And I wish everybody a nice evening. Thank you very much.